That's if you tell people you're Southern and you're from a farm, they want to know about cow tipping. They want to know about
all those fun things you used to do.
You're listening to the Help Me with HIPAA podcast, where HIPAA and humor collide to make learning fun. Your delightful hosts are Donna Grindle and David Sims. Relax, HIPAA help is on the way.
So let's talk about documentation around HIPAA compliance. So we both know that you can do everything right, but without documentation, you know what I say about documentation. If you don't document it, didn't happen. So let's talk about how we can prove that through documentation, how documentation fits with HIPAA compliance, and kind of run down that road.
The interesting thing is, I was reading, because I had surgery on my hand, so I can't type as much, so I read a lot more. And I was reading several articles, and I read like 4 different articles that all of them said something to the effect of document. It was in there. Every single one of them.
They get that from you?
Yeah, they did.
I remember going through the HIPAA training with you guys, however long ago it's been, 20 years ago, a few years ago. And I'll never forget. It was like every single training session, it was document.
Well, it's key, because just like you said, if it's not documented, it never happened. And OCR started saying that a couple of years ago. Don't tell me you're compliant, prove it. So then everybody says, just like you in the class and everybody else in the class, so you tell me to document everything. Could you tell me how to document everything?
How and what and when and where and all those questions.
Yeah, so it's important to document. We're getting that across. And then the next question is, could you embellish a tish on that actual topic? So the first thing we try to talk about is, what kinds of things do you document? So what kind of things do you document, David?
Well, initially I document policies and procedures. So That would be my first thing.
Very good.
That's what I do for myself. Now, obviously I deal as an IT provider for healthcare. I also have to deal with documentation for clients, whereas some of the listeners may not have to do that. They only just do their own documentation.
Well, and they need to make sure that their IT provider is doing it for their clients. If they have an IT provider themselves, they should be expecting the things you do for your clients, because you've been well trained to provide those things. That they should expect those same things. So while they don't have to do it except for themselves, they should have somebody doing that for their IT. Right.
And this might be a good place too to kind of give a little glossary term here for what is an MSP, or a managed service provider.
Yeah, it's an IT company that's always around, and they watch after your computers 24/7. How's that?
Yeah. So they're providing ongoing support. That it's not what we call in the IT industry, not break fix, where when something breaks, you call them to fix it. An MSP, it does just what their title is. They manage the services. They manage the IT environment. They're basically your IT department, but they're not in-house. They're outsourced.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way of looking at it. And they're not as expensive as hiring a high-end networking person that also understands security and can connect with your applications and transmissions. And that's an expensive person to get.
Right. So finding a HIPAA-compliant MSP or a HIPAA-compliant IT provider is very crucial because of the documentation that has to go into what you have to keep and document.
Right. So you want an IT provider that doesn't just say they're HIPAA compliant, they can document it. Ha ha.
There you go.
They can prove it.
And how would they prove it? Because somebody's going to ask.
Well, they should be able to show you all the documentation they're going to provide you on a regular basis that shows that the portions of the security rule that they are responsible for creating and managing for you is being monitored and regularly reviewed and audited. If they can give you that documentation, whether it be monthly or quarterly, and you don't want it any less, any more out than quarterly, monthly's good, but you want documentation that shows they're making sure that your compliance for patch management, because it's a huge thing. If your systems aren't up to date, then you can't be sure that you're secured. And, there was recently a $150,000 fine because they were using equipment that wasn't up to date, operating systems that weren't up to date. So you need somebody that's going to show that they're making sure all of your patches, not just for your operating system, but your applications are up to date. You want somebody to be able to show you your antivirus is running and it's up to date, not just the antivirus that came with the computer that you keep forever. But you need reports that show that this stuff is actually taking place. And I have people who have from their IT people, once a year, they get a spreadsheet that shows that somebody came in and went desk to desk to check things. That's inadequate in my opinion, but I'm sure others could argue that it is sufficient. And it's totally up to you whether you think that would pass muster when somebody's asking you to prove that it's taking place.
And there are organizations out there for IT providers that provide ongoing HIPAA compliance type information and training. So, if you're a covered entity and you kind of want to make sure your IT provider is serious about HIPAA compliance and keeping up with what's going on in that area, then there are associations out there, or at least one that I know of, that they can be a member of. And it's honestly not a bad idea to mention that to them as, are you a member of this? And it, like I said, it's just kind of shows that they're paying attention and they're doing what's best for you as a client. And that association that I'm referring to is called HIPAA4MSPs.com. And there's also, there's even some training they can get through there to which they can get a certificate as well as a seal called a Certified HIPAA Managed Service Professional. And that's kind of the gold seal to look for. If they have that seal, that's an indication that they have definitely went through HIPAA training and they pass an exam to prove they understand the concepts behind HIPAA and all that goes with that.
Indeed. So that covers a lot of the IT documentation and the things that you should request from your IT provider. But that is a lot of the security rule. It's not all of the security rule, and it's certainly not all the documentation you need to have in place.
We wish it was. We wish it was.
So they could come in and ask for, your risk analysis, your recent risk assessments. What is your training plan for your workforce? Who attended training? What kind of training? Where was it? When was it? How was the topic covered? Who taught it? All of those details need to be in place, and you should be able to pull that information quickly because when you're going to be asked for this documentation, it's not like you got a month or two to put it together. You get 10 days, 20 days tops. So it's not a long time to provide that turnaround. And they're actually setting up a website where you would upload it. So you're going to need to have it where you can readily produce it in a way that you can send it to them for review. And them, I mean OCR, Office for Civil Rights under HHS, because they're the ones that'll ask.
But we know the government producing websites is not something that they do very well. So. Which
is why it's been delayed 3 times.
It's amazing I can get my teenage son to create a website, but the government can't do it.
Yeah, but not so many people are going to be hitting the one your teenage son makes now, are they?
It depends on what he's got on there.
Yeah, really. 3 million people want to see your son's. You probably, one of those where they're jumping something crazy with the bicycle.
Yeah, and cracking her skull open.
Yeah. Those are the big traffic items. Just like that IBM commercial where it shows you the little hamster or whatnot is going to crash your network. So the training documentation we hit, the risk analysis, risk assessment, and then what's your risk mitigation project plan? What?
You got to mitigate?
What does that even mean? So if you did a risk analysis and risk assessment, which I love, people will show me that they did one. Okay, what's your risk mitigation plan? What? Well, that means anything you found in those assessments and analysis that needs to be done, you have to have a plan for doing it. And then you have to have a plan for following up on it. So the monitoring, the reports and the logs, as well as here's how I'm going to implement these updates or changes that I believe need to be made to protect PHI in my environment. That's always a very interesting one to see exactly what they provide with that, because there should be like a project plan. We both know project planning is not something that you do by the seat of your pants either. It's not then actually called a project plan. It's just, what do you want to work on today?
Well, that's a plan. I plan to get around to it.
Yeah. You ever get one of those round? It's like a little wooden coin that says to it.
Yeah.
There you go. I'm going to give you a round to it. So other documentation, BAAs, a business associate agreement. It is your contract that says, here is my responsibility and here's your responsibility. And these are the things we're going to do to protect the PHI that we are sharing between us to perform treatment, payment, or healthcare operations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is how we're going to protect the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of PHI. Bam.
Awesome. So the BA, which is the business associate, they have to agree to everything that's in that business associate agreement, which means if they agree to that, part of what should be in that agreement is that they are doing their part to keep themselves HIPAA compliant as well. Is that right?
And doing their own documentation. Yeah.
Right.
So a lot of people will sign those BAAs and they don't really know what's in them, or they think that it's not that big of a deal. But what a BAA is saying is exactly what you plan on doing. So the BAA with the most stringent requirements is how your business has to run in order for you to meet your obligations. Mm-hmm. And if you're a business associate, it's very complicated because you've got BAs with all of your clients who are covered entities, or they could be business associates. And then you've got BAs with your business associates and all those companies that provide services to you that help you do what you have to do and you're committed to do for your clients. And then you can have business associate agreements with subcontractors that work for you to provide those services. So it can get very complicated. And if the documentation isn't in line, you're in a ton of trouble if you don't have these things in place. Mm. And then you add to that, not just the contracts, but if I sign the contract, am I really doing the work, which is the BA due diligence?
Right. And that's the piece that kind of gives the covered entity or even the other BA business associate, it gives them the information they need to determine if that person is actually doing the work that you mentioned.
Yeah, you can't afford to let these folks take your data and not have some assurances beyond they sign the contract, because it's too late if they have the data and they're not protecting it. It's way too late. So ask the questions. You got to do some due diligence to ask some questions of your vendors about what they're actually doing to make sure they're meeting their end of the bargain.
So due diligence is not saying, "Hey, are you HIPAA compliant?" and getting the answer that you want to hear. So is that due diligence?
And it's not letting your business associate tell you they're HIPAA certified. We laugh at that because there's no such thing as truly HIPAA certified. The only entities that can say you're HIPAA compliant is HHS through OCR, and they don't offer any certification whatsoever because they realize they could come in, check everything today, and then tomorrow you just toss it out the window. So they don't have any certification thing. Wah, wah. That's
like, I mean, even with HIPAA compliance, one thing that I've seen other people do, IT providers particularly, is they'll say that they're giving you a HIPAA compliant service. Like, for instance, maybe they're using a HIPAA compliant backup service. Well, the company itself that's doing the backup might be compliant, and therefore their service might be compliant. But just because I resell that service doesn't automatically make me compliant. And
Agreed.
I see IT providers doing that, where they say, I'm providing you with a HIPAA compliant backup, therefore you're HIPAA compliant and I'm HIPAA compliant. And that's not the way it works. You can't just bring a bunch of HIPAA compliant services into your business and then therefore it makes you HIPAA compliant by default, by proxy, I guess.
Well, and the same thing happens with like billing services or transcription services. They'll tell you they're HIPAA compliant, but then when you start asking questions, it's clear that not so much. They're really not. And it's either through who they are getting their services from or what they're doing themselves. And if you're not certain about it, no matter what kind of BA it is that you fail to do some due diligence, then you're hanging out there. It's still your liability. It's not passed along if you're not certain and you don't ask them those questions. Now, a case where, it goes to the BA and the BA does something and it's totally opposite of what they've told you that they're doing, then you've got some ground to push that liability out to them. That you can't do much more than you get them to sign a contract and you get them to answer some questions and you have all of that documentation in place. It's about what could go wrong. So that's what all of the documentation when it comes to business associates really is needed for more than anything. Certainly OCR is going to ask you if you have it, and you better have it. But it's really, really important should something go wrong down in your business associates and you don't know what they're doing. You really seriously don't. And if you never ask, you're not going to have any idea. And the number of times that people tell us that, oh, so-and-so told us they're HIPAA compliant. And then you start asking a few questions and you find out that all they did was take a 1-hour webinar 2 years ago. And that's it. They call themselves compliant. So they have no documentation. They have no policies and procedures. They have no training program. They have none of those things. So that's why we have to ask.
Mm-hmm. I actually had a conversation with a client a while back, and they had a quote unquote HIPAA compliant IT company, and come to find out the IT company had been around a while and they knew HIPAA from 5, 6, 7 years ago. They had no idea that the changes that came down through the omnibus rule in 2013 had even come about. And they were still telling people that they dealt strictly with healthcare. They knew HIPAA inside and out, but they hadn't even kept up with what was going on over the past several years.
That would just make my heart stop. It really would if I stumbled upon it.
And that kind of goes back to
and
that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is making sure that your IT provider or other business associates are actually not just giving lip service to HIPAA, but they're actually doing things and doing training and keeping up with what's going on, because it does change.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm looking at a HIPAA compliance program, you have the work of HIPAA, which is the documentation, the due diligence, the contracts, the audits, the assessments, the mitigation plan, the keeping up with the inventories and monitoring equipment and having a breach response plan and all of those that's the work of HIPAA. And then you have the training of HIPAA, which is, a workforce training program, an advanced training program. You have your breach response team that's trained. You have all of those other things. And you have to have documentation to show that you're doing all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a business associate, you don't have to do the privacy rule stuff complete necessarily unless your services that you're providing may require part of that. If the services, in a lot of the business associate agreements, it says that you are responsible for the security rule and breach response requirements and the privacy rule as it applies to the covered entity you're doing the work for. So if the covered entity you're doing the work for is having you do something that affects their requirements of the privacy rule, things like you're doing marketing for them or you're doing fundraising for them, you need to know the requirements of the privacy rule, how that applies. So it's not as simple as many people try to make it when they look at what a business associate is required to do. And a lot of those things, creating that documentation to show you're doing the work of HIPAA and you're doing the training of HIPAA is that whole document.
Mm-hmm.
So you look at most of these places you go into and you ask for some documentation. A couple of years ago, back in 2012, it was happening a lot. I would go in and I would say, okay, show me your HIPAA documentation. And everybody at the table would look at each other and they'd say, where do you think that is? Don't we have a notebook somewhere? And they'd bring out a notebook and you'd hear it go,
blow the dust off of it.
Yeah. And that was their HIPAA documentation. And many people are still that way, is that their documentation does not consist of anything other than policies and procedures. That is inadequate. So doing the work of HIPAA is required by both a covered entity and a business associate, and you must document that you're doing the work of HIPAA. Same thing on a training and security awareness program. It's required of both a covered entity and a business associate, and you must document that you're doing it. So find a way to document it. And, at least once a year, but I can guarantee you, once a year training does not make it something that everybody keeps in front of them all the time. And that's what you need to truly have HIPAA compliance and that culture of compliance you're supposed to be going after.
Right. And we discussed that in another podcast as well about, having training that only happens once a year is just not going to be near enough for somebody to really even put it into practice. They don't know it well enough to put it into practice.
Yeah, there's a couple of different podcasts for training that we either have done or need to do. So,
yeah. We could probably do 10 of them just on BAs and due diligence and reporting.
Right. Yeah. So there's another one on that. But the key in this one is having the documentation. So, here's another one that's a good one is when we go in and you say, I need, and this is something your IT provider should be able to give you, I need an inventory of all the hardware that you have. And they're like, why do you care? Well, if I don't know where it is, how can I be sure that it's secured?
Mm-hmm.
So I need to know you have it. I need to know who has it, and I need to know how it's secured. So if you move it around and you update that documentation once a year, it's not going to be very helpful, and people move it and we have to wait. We'll see something go offline and then you have to wait to see it come back online. And then you're like, hey, who's using this and where'd it go?
Our ultrasound laptop is not there anymore. Anybody seen the ultrasound laptop?
Yeah. How do you know where, how do you know it's secured if you don't know where it is? So that documentation matters. People get frustrated because you're asking for this stuff. Okay, I can't be sure it's secured if we don't know where it is and how it's being used and what's on it. And the same thing goes with software. And we say, Give me a list of all the software you use. Well, I'm only going to give you the things that are clinical or that I use for billing. Well, no, I need to know everything, because if I don't know everything you're using, I may not be able to make sure that that software is up to date with security updates. And if it's not up to date with security updates, then guess what? That's a way in. So there's reasons that you need to do these things and have this documentation, because if you can't document where PHI comes and goes in your office, how can you be sure you secured it? Again, it's got to be documented in order for you to be sure that you're doing what you're supposed to do and what you're committed to doing. And then the new thing, the breach response plan. And so you got a lot of business associates saying they don't have to do this, that the covered entity is ultimately responsible. But the law says the covered entity can put it back on you. Recently, just in the last little bit, OCR in 2015 has updated their reporting tool where you report a breach and you say, are you a covered entity that's reporting one, or are you a business associate reporting one on behalf of a covered entity? So now the business associates are even being accounted for on breach reporting. And that means you have to have a plan. You have to have a response plan for dealing with a breach. No matter whether you're a business associate or covered entity, you have to know what a breach is and know what you're going to do if you have one. Much of what this is about is having a plan so that everybody isn't running around like a, as we say in the South, chicken with their head cut off. Have you ever you've seen one? I know you're Southern.
I have seen one.
And if you've never seen one, you don't really have that vision when you hear that little phrase. But if you've seen one, oh my God, they do.
It kind of goes hand in hand with, I'm going to wring your neck.
Yes, indeed. There's, plucking a chicken and all. Okay. Well, here we go.
Now I got a bad mental image.
I know.
A headless chicken
running around. It really happens, really. That's if you tell people you're Southern and you're from a farm, they want to know about cow tipping. They want to know about
all those fun things you used to do.
That's it. Now let's focus on HIPAA, not
it was a simpler
cow
time.
tipping. Yeah.
It was a simpler time. So the breach response plan, and there might be something else, and you may or may not agree with this, but I'll throw it out there. I see a lot of times where covered entities do not have a business associate agreement, and we'll go back to that for a minute, only because I want to bring up the breach response part of the agreement where it says how much time the business associate has to notify the covered entity. I have seen where the covered entity they don't have their own business associate agreement, so they go with whatever the business associate hands them. And in some cases, that can be all over the board on that particular time frame, which is really critical. I've seen people say, we'll let you know, within, 2 weeks, or we'll let you know within 45 days, or whatever the case might be. It's way too long, but it's all over the place. And that's one thing that covered entities need to look at.
Oh, indeed. I mean, yeah, it's not just have your documentation, but know what's in it.
Yeah.
And, and there's a whole thing that I actually did an article on last year about whose business associate agreement do you use, yours, mine, or ours, because, the business associates sign a ton of these, way more than most covered entities do. But the big covered entities sign a ton of them too. So you don't know what level you're going to get. So it's all fun in a negotiation. And if you don't know what's in there, again, I'll just take whatever you give me is a really bad idea. At least know what's in there and say, I'll take whatever you give me as long as it has no other requirements than X, Y, and Z. Know what you're willing to do, because that sets the bar that your company runs at, no matter what other things you sign. So if you just sign everything willy-nilly, you don't know what you've agreed to. You can't set the bar. So in that response plan is a key to it. And Now you'll see limitations of liability slipping in and out of there too, and you need to know what you're saying. So if you're a covered entity, don't be surprised if a business associate slips you an agreement that limits their liability if they have a breach and says you're more responsible than they are, because everybody's trying to slip something in there about limitations of liabilities, as well as how quickly you have to turn around. And there's a lot of varying opinions on where does the clock start for a breach response. So that's a whole nother, the breach rule itself is a whole nother podcast. The specification in there says how many days from the discovery. And remember, the law says the discovery or when you should have known. So if anybody in your organization knows, that's when the clock starts. Even if they skip something. If you've got something coming out in a report that no one pays attention to, but it's telling you about a breach, whenever it started coming out on that report, that's when the breach happened. That's why, even though you may be getting documentation every month showing you that the logs and all that stuff's active, you better read it from time to time, because it may be telling you something. And from the minute that first showed up is when you should have known you have a breach. And that's when the clock started for your breach response. And your team needs to be in place. And all the things that you're supposed to do about the breach rule is keyed on that 60-day time frame of the clock starting at when you discovered or should have discovered.
And don't assume that other people are looking at the documentation. I mean, if you're getting documentation from your IT provider, even though they should be looking at it, don't assume they're looking at it and they're just going to tell you if they see something wrong.
Or at least ask them to provide you documentation on top of the documentation that shows they reviewed it.
Yeah, that would be great.
I want you to document that you've documented that you document that you saw the document. So,
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that.
Well, that's what I always say in class, right? I need you to document that you are going to document that you documented what you said should be documented.
Can you add another one in there?
Probably, if I try.
And that's why I'm a big fan of using a third-party compliance company like Carding Compliance, because I like the fact that there's a third party that's making sure that my client is protected and they're doing the right things. And they're also looking over my shoulder to make sure that my company's doing the right things. And so, I'm not afraid to say, hey, make sure that I don't miss something. It's just a good idea, in my opinion. It's another level of protection. It's just like when I think about protecting somebody's network, I do it in layers of security and protection. It's the same thing, the way I see it, of having that protection in place where you having somebody look over your shoulder.
Yeah, I mean, I often ask people questions to have them look over my shoulder. I mean, you can't have too much of that. So we do need to get on to one other part. So now we've said, let's make piles and piles of documentation. How do you actually manage that comes the next question. And
spiral notebooks, 3-ring binders, manila folders.
I have clients that, it's a pretty large organization, and the guy likes 3-ring binders, and that's what he's going to put all this stuff in. And no matter how I get him, try to get him to put it somewhere else. Nope. I'm going to put it in these 3-ring binders. Okay. Well, what's your fire plan? What are you going to do if you can't get to the 3-ring binder? Well, we have multiple copies of them. Where are they? How can you get to them? How do you know? So, it's fine if that's what you're going to do, but you need to have a plan to have it accessible, because if it's not accessible, no one's going to use it.
We can't get them in the cloud, so we just stuck them on the roof. So what are the options? Is there any requirement under HIPAA? Like, does it say you have to document this way or that way or in these particular formats?
What's reasonable and appropriate. That's it. The good thing about HIPAA is it gives you the ability to adapt, and it was designed to work down to a one-person business all the way up to a huge Blue Cross Blue Shield or Aetna, a huge payer, same law applies. There's no different laws, no different regulation from that perspective. But the downside is same law applies. And you've got to figure out how you can accomplish these things. And so a lot of people, even the large institutions, people believe, here, I'm just going to do this with spreadsheets, documents, and folders. And they use whatever their document management system that the company uses. And that's fine. Use the project tools and the document management tools that the organization that you work for, whatever they use, and then it's accessible and it's something that you can get to. But if you don't have one at all, then you can't really, you got to build something. You got to build a plan for how you're going to manage your documentation. And if you stick it in with everything else, you better be able to make sure that no one else is modifying it, and only those that need to are able to do things with it, and that it's always available, and it's not something that's thrown to the bottom of the list of when it gets restored or something like that. The spreadsheet and document in a folder or document management tool that just indexes stuff, that's what a lot of people use. I'm a fan of other things, but I'm a software person.
Now, before we get into the other things, I'm sure that's where we're going. You kind of stepped around something that I want to kind of drag you back to. You made a comment that said something about having different versions of your documentation. So is it necessary or required, or however you want to say it, to make sure that you keep a running history of documentation and who makes changes and all that kind of things to your documents?
Why, David, that's an excellent question.
That's why I asked.
That's a good point. So the current guidance says that you must keep a history of your documentation for 6 years to show that you have ongoing compliance activity for 6 years. So 6 years of information required as part of the compliance guidance. And that means that, your 3-ring binders are going to get big.
That's going to be a lot of clouds.
Yeah.
It's going to be a cloudy day.
Yeah. So the roof is on fire.
Oh, Lordy.
So, and for those of you who don't know that song, you should check it out. Many a party in the 80s was lit up with that song. So, the 6-year rule means that at some point you're going to need to pull something from 5 years ago. Can you do it? And so when you design a system, you need to know that you're going to need to do that. If you're keeping something in some sort of format that now you can't access back the last 5 years ago, you're going to have an issue.
Now, would it also be good to keep up with who's making changes? Like, so if somebody edited that document, there's maybe a log or something with it, or if it's software, I'm sure it can log it automatically.
Yeah, well, yeah, the software does log it automatically, but you have to keep copies of all of your policies and procedures as you change them. So if there is something that we're going back to, say, June of 2012, we need to see what occurred in June of 2012. Well, I need to know what policies and procedures were in effect in June of 2012. So I can't just keep updating the one I have, because now how am I going to easily get back to June of 2012? So every time there's a substantial change to a policy or a procedure, you have to keep the archive, if you will, and then you say, okay, now here's version 3 or version 6 of whatever this is. And there has to be a system that's showing you what versions you're looking at, and you have to know, okay, 2012, it would have been this one. And you pull it out and you can reference it quickly. So any documentation plan you have needs to have that in mind. So when you do it, you need to test that concept to say, can I find this 5 or 6 years from now and know for sure this is what I was using then.
So what type of compliance and documentation management tools are best practices? With all we talked about, there's a lot involved. There's a lot of documentation. There's a lot of follow-up. There's so much going on. There's got to be ways that is just easier than other ways. So what are we looking at?
Well, standardizing it is key, because if you don't have a standard, it's willy-nilly and there's no way that you can keep up with it. You can make sure it's being done and that you can keep up with it 5 years ago. So some method of standardization, no matter how you do it, and whether you get somebody to help you build the business process around it, whatever you need to do, that plan is key. So just like in our class, we say, you must have a document management plan, period. Now, how are you going to do it? Go figure it out within your systems. For us, we use software to do it. We use a cloud-based application called Comply Assistant, and it's a tool that allows us to have all of that work of compliance in one place. So our documentation, our project plan, our assessments, our audit plans, our audits, the policies and procedures, the contracts, the due diligence, it's all in one place, and we have everything we need to make sure that the activity is being documented and monitored. So we can go in and look at what activity has occurred. When was the last time that activity occurred? So some people don't like it. We actually had a doctor call us or met us at a trade show one time, and he was tell me about this tool. So we tell him, so I can log in at any time and see what activities taken place for your compliance and track, what users are doing it, what kind of activities taking place, and showed him the activity list and the history. And he looked at me with just a stone cold face and said, well, then they're going to know I'm not doing it. I laughed because I thought he was joking. And he kind of got mad. I couldn't help it. I thought he was joking, and he was kind of mad at me. I was like, really? Oh.
This is not a joke. It's for real.
Yeah. And you probably don't need to be talking to us, because if you're trying to find a way that you can document things but not have people know you're not really doing it, our product's not for you. So let me know when you are ready to take a different approach. I'm not going to, but I did. I laughed, right? Like you and I, that'd be something you said, No, it didn't go well for me. But clearly not a client I wanted, but still, you hate to do that. I mean, you got anybody that they say something very serious like that, and then you bust out laughing, and they were serious.
Well, maybe it'll make him go back and really think about it.
Yeah, I hope so. Well, he never came back, but I don't know what reason that is. Is it that I insulted him, or he's just not doing it?
Yeah.
So, but the beauty of using the tools are they have things built in, and we're able to build in things like the OCR audit protocol is built into the assessments and the audits that we do. The prompts that OCR ask you about when you're reporting a breach, it's built into the system. So it's going to ask you those same questions. So you're kind of prepared to answer those things, and you're documenting it. You're documenting it as you go. How about that? So as soon as something comes up, we create an incident, we create an issue, whatever it is, and we start keeping the documentation of all the discussions about it within the tool right away. So that's the advantage of using a tool, because it has a thing that's clearly designed for X and a thing that's clearly designed for Y, instead of me having to figure out something for those things. And so I'm a big fan of it, but I see the world as an IT person. So,
Do you find that people who are doing the documentation, do you find that sometimes it's scattered where some documentation will be in, let's say, Microsoft Word, and some of it will be in Google Apps, and some of it will be in a notebook somewhere? Do you see that happening as well?
A lot. That's why we come in and say, you have to have a plan. Right now, you have none. And, even if you're going to stick with the notebooks, there's no plan about how am I going to access that 5 years from now? How do I keep up with my archive? How do I access it if there's a fire? How do I get to it if, I'm not in the office and somebody else needs to see a policy or procedure, or someone needs to look something up? How do they find it? Mm-hmm. So have a plan that covers the amount of documentation you're going to need, the kinds of documentations you're going to keep, and the different people that are going to be creating it for you. So one of the cool things is Comply Assistant. We can set up the IT vendor with a login, and we give them an assigned task to upload their monthly report that shows that things are being done, not like the logs. We don't want to store the logs themselves. I mean, that's huge. But the monthly report that shows that things are getting done, they can upload it.
Okay. Sounds easier. Sounds much easier.
Well, it does to you and I, but there's a lot of people that just swear by, they feel comfortable with their spreadsheets, and they feel comfortable that they're going to be able to do it the way that, in the folders and the documents and the spreadsheets, and they can create their own systems. And that's fine too. Again, though, what happens when you're not there? You just got to make sure your plan covers all those things. There you go. There's an article.
Write it down.
I should write it down.
So I'm going to put you on the spot here. In our closing comments, one thing that we hear all the time, and I say this a lot, is we hear people get overwhelmed. And in listening to this podcast, I'm sure most people are going, oh gosh, this is crazy, the amount of things I have to do. When you talk about reasonable and appropriate, this is all not reasonable for me to do. It's very unreasonable to think I can do all this. So here's my question I'm going to throw at you that you're not prepared for. Since this is such a big thing, and documentation is a big thing, and it's a big project, it's ongoing all the time, what is the one thing or the first step, because everything just starts with a single step. So what is the first step that a listener can do to just start down the path to doing this the right way?
We'll work on that document management plan. Find everything that you have right now and figure out what documentation do you have and are you keeping? Step number 1. So where am I? Step number 2 is, what tools do I have today that I can use to properly manage all this documentation I know I need to create? Because if I don't have a place to put it, it's irrelevant if I get it, because I'm going to lose it. I'm not going to have it all available. And then, so we focus on what's next. Well, next would be figure out what you got. Then after that, figure out what tools you have, and then figure out what other options or what methods you will do to manage your documentation. And if you do those 3 things, then you can go and target the areas that you're most lacking in documentation and start bringing it in and finding ways to create it. And especially things that you can push out to somebody else. Like, my IT vendor should be able to provide a ton of documentation for my security rule compliance. Well, you're not having to do that. You're asking them to do it. Mm-hmm. And it should be part of the services.
So the main thing is just to keep it as simple as you possibly can. Don't make it any harder than it has to be.
Yeah, the KISS method.
Keep it super simple.
Yeah, we'll go with that.
You've been listening to the Help Me with HIPAA podcast, hosted by Donna Grindle and David Sims. The show created to help you with HIPAA. For more information or to ask us a question, visit our website at helpmewithhipaa.com. Neither Donna Grindle or David Sims are attorneys, and they do not offer binding legal advice concerning regulatory compliance. The information in this podcast should not be relied upon or construed as legal advice in any way. Consult your attorney for legal advice concerning compliance with HIPAA regulations.